Yeah, yeah. Well, the counteroffensive has begun. This was the subject of months of hype, all these breathless predictions. People like General David Petraeus saying that Ukraine's going to deliver a knockout blow to Russia, and the offensive is going underway. And by all accounts, if people could correct me if I'm wrong, it doesn't look like it's going very well for Ukraine. They took a few farming villages in Donetsk, I believe, that apparently are not very significant and might have even have been abandoned. I'm sure, obviously, there were some areas where they killed some Russians, which is one of the aims. But overall, there are just so many accounts, even in Western media, which is normally incredibly jingoistic and just on board with the proxy war, just admitting this is not going well. So, for example, this is one account in the Washington Post. I'll just read like the first few paragraphs. Hear this. The men of Ukraine's 37th Brigade were freshly trained and armed with Western supplied weapons, tasked with an initial push through Russian-occupied territory in the early days of a long-awaited counteroffensive. They would pay a heavy price. Within 20 minutes of their June 5th advance in the southeast Donetsk region, mortars exploded all around them, soldiers said. A 30-year-old soldier known as Lumberjack saw two of the men in his vehicle bleeding heavily. One lost an arm as he cried out for his family. Lumberjack crawled into a crater, but the shrapnel from a mortar went through the soil and pierced his shoulder. We were left there in the field without tanks or heavy armor, he said. We were shelled with mortars from three sides. We couldn't do anything. There were fewer than 50 men in the unit, he said, and 30 did not return. They were killed, wounded, or captured by the enemy. 5 of the unit's armored vehicles were destroyed within the first hour. So that's the Washington Post, an account of just one unit. But by all the accounts that I've seen, that's kind of the emerging picture so far, at least.
Well, I've been watching closely, Aaron, as to gain a barometer on how well the counteroffensive is doing. I've been watching corporate media closely because these outlets and the correspondents who are now embedded in Zaporozhye would gain libidinal satisfaction and joy from any Ukrainian advance. And so far, they have been politically and psychologically cock-blocked by the reality on the ground. I saw a report by CNN's Fred Fleitgen, who's their correspondent there, and he wasn't able to report any advances by the Ukrainians. And then they instead turned to one major victory in this counteroffensive. It was unbelievable. One single Russian soldier near Bakhmut allegedly surrendered to a drone. So they focused their entire segment on one Russian soldier retreating while being monitored by a drone. And I don't even know if that story is accurate, but that was the victory that they could claim on CNN. And this came after hours and hours and hours of Trump indictment coverage, which is something they can be a little bit more excited about. And then you have the Washington Post. You have Reznikov, the defense minister of Ukraine, making some noises about negotiation. I don't know if that's to pressure his Western patrons into delivering more weapons. You have Putin at the St. Petersburg, at a major conference in St. Petersburg yesterday, declaring that we are burning Leopard tanks and we will burn the F-16s. And the Pentagon spokesman is refusing to answer questions from members of the Beltway Press Corps about how many Bradley fighting vehicles were lost. However, the Pentagon has just allocated a new $325 million shipment of Bradley fighting vehicles to Ukraine to replace those that are gone. And here you have my tweet where I note that according to CNN, 15% of all Bradley fighting vehicles supplied to Ukraine were destroyed in pretty much one day, 1 or 2 days. And so we have to pay out of pocket to replace these. Scott Ritter, who's, former Marine intelligence officer, UN weapons inspector, has been on this program before, gave a 3-hour interview to the Duran. I don't know how he does it. Scott's on he's on all the time. I want whatever he's taking. And I don't know how he doesn't lose his voice, but it was a brilliant interview in which he explains that the Bradley fighting vehicles being supplied to the Ukrainians, first of all, are Desert Storm era Bradley fighting vehicles. They're not the newest ones, but they're much more difficult to learn and to take out into the field and to then repair than the Soviet era and Russian made fighting vehicles that the Ukrainian military is accustomed to, and that they may not even know how to use these. In Scott's overall analysis is this is a NATO counteroffensive. It's a combined arms counteroffensive directed by NATO, testing out NATO weaponry, and he believes that the Ukrainians have been cursed by NATO to have all of this supposedly advanced Western weaponry imposed on them that they don't necessarily know how to use. They've only had a few months to learn. Whatever we're seeing in the field appears. I mean, this is Scott's view. It's not. I don't have the military wherewithal to say this, but in Scott's view, there is zero chance of the counteroffensive succeeding. So far, they have not penetrated the outer lines of heavily fortified Russian defenses, and this is the Russian forte of lines and lines of dug-in defenses. I mean, it's a country that has been under siege for centuries. This is their defense doctrine at its core, and Ukraine is going into the heart of it. I was reading earlier today some self-styled military experts on Substack. One guy named Goya, who's a former Marine, who had kind of charted out their ideal Ukrainian counteroffensive, what it would look like. And it would be heavily dependent on what they called lightning strikes with drones and air power, as well as the fires, artillery strikes, softening up Russian positions, then sending in sappers to take out the lines. None of that's happening because their air power, to the extent they had any, particularly their drones, has been neutralized by Russian anti-aircraft defenses. So it's looking so far disastrous. And what does this mean politically? It means, well, there are two ways of looking at it. One, I think it's obvious. It's very much like I would draw a parallel to Aleppo, Aaron, where it was kind of the last stand of the Al-Qaeda aligned Turkish, NATO, and Gulf-backed forces in East Aleppo, in 5 districts in East Aleppo in around like September 2016. Turkey kind of pulled the plug on them. They stopped sending in the weapons. They were encircled by the Syrian Arab army with Russian support. And that pretty much spelled the end of the dirty war and forced a negotiation that the West just refused to participate in through Astana. So it was that was it. And I think this may be it as well. Although, of course, the West and Secretary of State Tony Blinken, no matter what, have no intention of negotiating or pulling back. And when I say this is it, I mean that Ukraine will have to decide. They have, 12 brigades left. Do they want to erode the rest of their military and allow Russia to possibly push forward to Odessa and Kharkiv and take all of eastern Ukraine, which would happen if their military completely collapsed? Or do they want to start some kind of process? And if the counteroffensive succeeded, first Anne Applebaum would have continuous orgasms for days and days and days until she had to be hospitalized. And then second, the war would continue for years because it would create a pressure cooker around Crimea, and it would possibly escalate. I mean, we'd be talking about tactical nuclear weapons then. So the failure of this counteroffensive is good for negotiations, in my view. I don't know if it will fail. I don't know as much as Scott or others, but so far it doesn't seem to be going that well. And Aaron, I mean, it doesn't look like Tony Blinken cares either way.
No, this is what Tony Blinken said recently. He laid out basically the U.S. vision for the war in a recent speech in Finland. The vision was basically no diplomacy with Russia, no ceasefire, and just no matter what happens in this counteroffensive, just permanent conflict and arming Ukraine to the teeth. And just to contrast what the picture Max laid out about the state of Ukraine's military in this counteroffensive with what Blinken says here, which seems to me so out of touch with reality. Listen to what he says about Ukraine's military.
By virtually every measure, President Putin's invasion of Ukraine has been a strategic failure. The Kremlin often claimed it had the second strongest military in the world, and many believed it. Today, many see Russia's military as the second strongest in Ukraine. The United States welcomes any initiative that helps bring President Putin to the table to engage in meaningful diplomacy. We'll support efforts, whether by Brazil, by China, or any other nation, if they help find a way to a just and lasting peace, consistent with the principles of the United Nations Charter.
Yeah, and what he means by that is, as long as we'll support any peace proposal that gives Ukraine all of its territory back, including Crimea, which, again, we all know the history, historically a part of Russia. Russia seized it after the 2014 US-backed Maidan coup, and it's never giving it back. So basically, Blinken is saying no peace. And that line he has about how, many people thought that Russia had the second strongest army in the world, but actually it's the second strongest army in Ukraine. It's so delusional. And just look at now the picture we're getting from the counteroffensive so far, where all these Ukrainian forces infused with Western training and equipment are getting seriously decimated, at least by the accounts that we've seen. And that's after, of course, so many soldiers on the front lines for Ukraine had to suffer because Ukraine was holding back its troops and its equipment to prepare for this counteroffensive. And there's a recent article in the New Yorker by Luke Mogelson, who deployed with a Ukrainian battalion on the front lines. And the picture he paints was so dire. And that was before this counteroffensive. And there's even a line from some top Ukrainian official where they said, speaking of the soldiers fighting as they were preparing for the counteroffensive, like, they'll have to forgive us because we need to pull back and prepare for the counteroffensive. And now they had the counteroffensive, and at least from what we can tell, it's just not going very well. And the vision for Blinken and Newland, and this has been laid out, in Blinken's speech and in all these articles that have come out, in just talking to established media outlets like the Washington Post and New York Times, it's just basically turning Ukraine into Israel, perpetually in conflict with its neighbors, no comprehensive peace agreement. So, Russia laid out this really sweeping draft treaty in December 2021 with all of its grievances, NATO expansion, NATO military infrastructure surrounding Russia. And Russia simply said, we want you to roll it back to the pre-1997 levels before there was this new round of massive NATO expansion. And also address the fact that you have these missile sites in Poland and Romania that are aimed at Russia. These U.S. missile sites. And the U.S. basically wouldn't talk about pretty much any of Russia's proposal, except for narrowly on a couple of issues, but even there with caveats. And I don't see how the Biden administration will somehow reverse that position. Like, if they wouldn't talk to Russia to prevent the war, I don't see how they could go and do it now, because that would look, quote unquote, weak. And so this basically just means permanent frozen conflict with Ukraine just basically being used as a bulwark and increasingly militarized, and maybe some occasional skirmishes, but just no peace agreement at all, whether it's certainly between the U.S. and Russia. That to me is just off the table.
Jens Stoltenberg, the NATO Secretary General, delivered a press conference from NATO headquarters about 48 hours ago, where he said that we cannot judge the success of Ukraine's counteroffensive, but he has suggested in his speech that the success of this counteroffensive was contingent on Ukraine's NATO accession moving forward. And there is a NATO meeting in Vilnius 1 month from now, or a little less than a month from now. I think it's July 11th. And that will be it'll be interesting, because by then we'll really be able to gain a clear picture of the counteroffensive. General Milley, Petraeus, they introduced this lie that Russia's offensive into Kiev, remember the initial offensive, the initial thrust, would succeed in 72 hours. And they did that in order to paint Russia as a failure. And now there's kind of another narrative claiming Ukraine has 72 hours to succeed. But I think the real figure that I'm seeing from hardcore pro-Ukraine supporters and the Ukrainian government itself is like 6 weeks. So by that time, there will be the NATO meeting, and it'll be interesting to hear what the ministers have to say there about Ukraine as Ukraine's NATO membership. But either way, Aaron, I think you're right. The NATOization of Ukraine will continue. And what do you think this means for the counteroffensive means for Biden? It seems to be one of the key planks of his re-election effort.
Yeah, well, check this out. This is from the Washington Post. This is how, like, they had this big article about the stakes of the counteroffensive for both the U.S. and Ukraine. And this is what they say about the U.S. And this is by Karen DeYoung, veteran Washington Post diplomatic correspondent. She writes this: as he heads into next year's re-election campaign, Biden needs a major battlefield victory to show that his unqualified support for Ukraine has burnished U.S. global leadership, reinvigorated a strong foreign policy with bipartisan support, and demonstrated the prudent use of American military strength abroad. So you notice how none of this has anything to do with defending Ukraine, right? The whole point, I thought, of arming Ukraine to the teeth is to defend it. But this is the Washington Post laying out Biden's real agenda for it, which is that it's to show strength, to show U.S. global leadership, a strong policy, and the prudent use of American military strength. It's all about the U.S. image, basically, and self-image and existence as a hegemon. That's what it's all about. And he needs this for his re-election campaign. That's how they see it. And I think she's capturing the thinking inside the White House. This has nothing to do with Ukraine or defending it or its well-being. This has to do with protecting U.S. supremacy. And Biden's basically hinging his re-election on it. And that's why he's not going to back down. But I don't think he's going to give Ukraine NATO membership because he knows that's a disaster for NATO, because that would bound NATO to fight directly with Russia, and Biden doesn't want that. The whole point of the NATO pledge was to bait Russia to help bring it into a war, to bleed it, but not to actually fight Russia directly. And so this dance will just keep going on, and the U.S. has locked itself in that ever since they gave Ukraine this promise back in 2008, which many people knew like they would never actually fulfill. But of course, because the U.S. can't back down because they want to show strength, it's just this endless loop of conflict and escalation with no resolution.
And last point, something very few have considered: when is Ukraine's next presidential election? It is spring 2024, and that could bring Zelensky down potentially. So
yeah,
that's another key date to mark down. I think it's the last weekend in March, according to the Ukrainian constitution. Zelensky has pretty much until then to show some major success. Otherwise, you could see the West backing someone else. If he's still alive by then, I assume he will be.
right.
I don't think he's going to go out like other former U.S. favorites like Manuel Noriega or Saddam Hussein. But there isn't a very good track record there.
Right.
So we'll keep following this story. Obviously, we're going to have to, but it'd be really interesting if we could get someone credentialed for the NATO meeting in Vilnius to ask some tough questions, because I don't know if the rest of the press is going to be doing that.
Yeah, we know someone who's going, so maybe we can get some questions posed there. We have some breaking news as we're recording this that I think we should address, which is that Daniel Ellsberg has passed at the age of 92. Daniel Ellsberg, of course, was diagnosed with cancer and was a few months ago decided that he was going to stop going through all the procedures and just spend the last time here with his family at home. And so he's just passed. He, of course, leaked the Pentagon Papers, helped end the Vietnam War. And I wanted to actually, there was recently an interview done with him by Politico. I think one of the last interviews, if not the last interview he did. And I just want to read this one paragraph because till the end, Daniel Ellsberg was speaking out against U.S. militarism and hegemony, and with, especially with regards to the war in Ukraine. So this is from this Politico article. It says this: during the course of our 1 hour and 20-minute interview, Ellsberg contended America still runs a covert empire around the world, embodied in the U.S. domination of NATO. He believes Washington deliberately provoked Vladimir Putin into invading Ukraine by pushing its seat of power eastward toward Russia's borders, that the mainstream media is complicit in allowing the government to keep secrets It has no right to withhold. And then any notion Americans are ever the good guys abroad has always been false. That's from, I think, the last interview that Ellsberg ever did.
Oh, wait, at the same, go, can we go back to that?
Yeah.
Look at the line before that.
Oh, yeah. Well, you know, I
At
didn't
the
wanna
same
read it.
time, Horton believes that
Yeah.
Ellsberg, like other whistleblowers, occasionally sees conspiracy when evidence is scant. Oh yeah, the
Yeah.
evidence is scant that this is about a covert empire, or that the U.S. is not the good guys abroad.
And that Horton there is, I mean, is Scott Horton, who's a attorney, not Scott Horton, the
The
anti-war
centrist Scott
libertarian.
Horton, who writes for
Yeah.
Harper's and like
Exactly. Who
allowed Alan Dershowitz to beat him in a debate about Israel that I watched once.
he's also was this should not surprise anyone. Scott Horton, again, we're talking about Scott Horton, the centrist attorney, not Scott Horton, friend of the Grayzone anti-war radio host.
So
This Horton was like a diehard Russiagate dupe, like
oh yeah,
insane Russiagate.
he went bonkers on. He was one of those guys you check it in his Facebook page, and you know it was like it was cringeworthy.
Yeah.
Like a lot of liberals at that time, they had just descended into a rabbit hole and fallen in a rat's nest. But the back to Daniel Ellsberg, for those who don't know, he was a special forces soldier, saw intense combat in Vietnam, and was able to and became a whistleblower against the war because of the horrors he saw. He was able to spirit the so-called Pentagon Papers out of the Pentagon. Many of them were like signals intelligence, and get them to the Brookings Institution, where they were then held. Nixon and his aide Chuck Colson planned to firebomb the Brookings Institution so they could then send in agents disguised as firefighters to steal those documents. They also waged a dirty tricks campaign against Ellsberg to paint him as crazy, where I think they stole or attempted to steal his psychiatrist records. It was at a time when like not everyone went to therapy. Like now, if you don't go to therapy, you're seen as crazy. But then it was like, so, and it parallels the campaign against Julian Assange, where he was initially painted as crazy, misogynistic, a rapist, anything to discredit him before he was eventually captured and is being physically destroyed in prison. And Ellsberg was one of the most important supporters of Julian Assange, as well as Edward Snowden and so many other whistleblowers who were persecuted beginning under Barack Obama. He appeared in protests against the U.S. coup against Venezuela, as well as condemning the NATOization of Ukraine and the push for not just a new Cold War, but even a potential hot war with Russia. And it was the courage that it took to do what he did during Vietnam was still present now. And he was not being cheered on by liberal media. He was not portrayed as the hero that he was seen as in the 1970s, when the Vietnam War had been discredited and he exposed Nixon's secret bombing campaign in Cambodia. So I think it still took courage for Ellsberg to take those stands today, when simply being anti-war in Washington makes you a pariah.
Yeah. He kept his integrity until the end, which is such a hard thing to do, especially when you become a sort of a celebrated figure. There's pressure on you to, just basically take your place amongst the liberal intelligentsia that can now acknowledge what you did 50 years ago, but not to call them out for what they're doing today. And he never caved to that. And it's really impressive. I heard from him about a year ago, with a nice note of encouragement for the stuff I was writing about Ukraine, and that meant a lot to me. And he's a force. I mean, he changed the world, and that also level of sacrifice, like he was willing to go to prison for the rest of his life. He knew exactly what he was facing. He was willing to do it. And there are not too many people like that who are willing to give up their freedom, their life for humanity. And he was one of them. And his impact is immeasurable.
R.I.P. Daniel Ellsberg.
All right, let's move on to Trump. Trump was arraigned this week in his latest indictment for retaining classified information. He's being charged under the Espionage Act, which I thought as leftists were supposed to oppose, but apparently now the Espionage Act is good.
Yeah, the Espionage Act is going to save democracy. And the FBI, I saw a Democratic member of Congress who I didn't recognize on CNN yesterday stating that calling for defunding the FBI is just like calling for defunding the police. And so we just shouldn't do it on that basis, because several of Trump's allies in Congress are now calling for investigating the FBI for this.
Raphael Warnock, Senator Warnock, I know said something similar this week about how horrible it is to attack the FBI. He called it, here it is. I'll show it to you. He said, this is Raphael Warnock, who, remember when he was first came on the scene nationally, he was like, attacked for being mildly pro-Palestinian, and he was going to be different. Here he is now. Senator Raphael Warnock says Republican criticisms of the FBI and law enforcement in the wake of the indictment of Trump are unconscionable. So it's unconscionable to criticize the FBI. From a pastor from Georgia, who should know about the history of the FBI targeting.
Well, he's at like
Dr. King.
He steps in. He basically is he at the Ebenezer Baptist Church?
Yeah.
Like King's church.
Yeah.
So he's it's unconscionable to criticize the FBI that was monitoring MLK and setting the stage for his assassination through a campaign of outrageous, dirty tricks, painting him as a comm simp, an agent of the Soviet Union in media, planting stories about him. That's a perfect indication of how far the Democratic Party has gone from MLK's legacy while embracing it the most insincere way possible. But back to the Trump indictment, I think one of the most important pieces of commentary on this indictment in criticizing it came in the form of a Tucker Carlson 13-minute rant. It was, I think, his second Twitter show since he's been either removed or silenced by Fox. Fox is, of course, threatening a lawsuit against Tucker for continuing to speak during election season. And Tucker's general thesis was that, sure, Trump, he didn't say this, but seems to be what he's suggesting. Sure, Trump might have made some huge mistakes, which opened him up to an indictment. But all presidents have done that. Other presidents have committed massive crimes. What Trump's real crime was destroying the Bush family over the issue of Iraq and 9/11 on the debate stage, and then continuing to at least rhetorically attack the war state, even as he wound up fulfilling some of its biggest fantasies. And Tucker always says the problem with Trump is not what he does or threatens to do, but what he might say. And I basically agree with that. I mean, you can just look at a picture of Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un embracing if you want to understand why he's being indicted. He's being called out for some ticky-tack foul compared to what Dick Cheney and George W. Bush, whose statute of limitations has not run out, did over the Iraq war, including, I mean, if you want to be from an establishment point of view, Dick Cheney outed a CIA undercover officer to get revenge on her husband because he helped expose the lie of WMD.
Right.
Dick Cheney nothing ever happened to Dick Cheney. They found a fall guy, Scooter Libby. So, I mean, we could go on and on. There's no way you're going to convince me, first of all, that the Espionage Act is legitimate or that Donald Trump must be indicted when everyone else whose crimes we've witnessed, including minor stuff compared to lying the U.S. into war, like destroying emails marked classified, thousands of them, that they were not classified, that they were not indicted. It's obviously politicized. And so in response to Tucker's Twitter commentary, we have Kyle Kulinski, I don't think I've ever mentioned him before on the Grayzone, but I just thought this was perfect. He's arguing with a straight face that Trump is only being prosecuted because he's anti-war. This is the most dishonest, disingenuous, weaselly BS I've ever heard. And tomorrow I'm going to nuke it into oblivion. Tucker knows he's flat out lying. The most disingenuous, weaselly BS he's ever heard. Okay, so it's more disingenuous and weaselly than, I don't know, claiming that Saddam Hussein and Al Qaeda are working together, or that he sent agents to Niger to obtain yellow cake to make enriched uranium for WMD, possibly even nuclear weapons, that the smoking gun, that we might see a mushroom cloud before we obtain the smoking gun, and that's why we need to go into Iraq. I mean, he's saying this is the most disingenuous BS. And then beyond that, what he's saying, and this is supposed to be like a voice of alternative independent media that distrusts the establishment. What he's saying is that this indictment is just purely about the rule of law. And that is the core talking point of the establishment. This is just about enforcing the rule of law. But anyone who's lived in this country or seen what's been happening in this country knows the rule of law is not being enforced. And that while it is always nice to see someone who has the level of power Trump has held accountable, the people who have committed the worst crimes are welcomed back with open arms into the establishment, like George W. Bush. So there are still two systems of justice. This is obviously politicized, and it's about preventing someone from running for president who is not just the front runner in the Republican Party, but the front runner overall. Now, it's already going to backfire on a political level. I don't know. Legally, they might have him wrapped up. I mean, it looks like a pretty good indictment from the point of view of the people trying to wrap him up. But politically, they're focusing all the attention on Donald Trump. And then you have all these minor candidates trying to jump in, vying for attention. No one cares about them anymore. All anyone's going to be talking about for the next year and a half is Donald Trump because of this. And then you've completely incited Donald Trump supporters into a frenzy because they feel totally disenfranchised, as they already have. And this has confirmed all of their worst critiques of the deep state. How that's going to play out, I don't know, but we saw how it played out on January 6th.
I mean, it's 6+ years of this. There was Russiagate, where they framed him as a Russian asset. When that failed, then they immediately pivoted to Ukraine Gate, where they impeached him over the phone call with Zelensky. And then it was going to be, and then they did the Russian bounties thing, which was not lawfare, but it was similar in terms of like the national security state putting out information that was fake to undermine Trump, to make it look as if he was weak in the face of Russia killing or putting bounties on U.S. soldiers in Afghanistan. Then it was the January 6th impeachment. Then it was Stormy Daniels and him being indicted for that. And now it's this. It's like Trump supporters have a lot of evidence that there is lawfare being used to undermine him, that the national security state and the Justice Department are being weaponized to undermine him. I mean, everyone, it's so obvious now. I mean, and that's the context that has to be recognized here. And
yeah, I mean, this is relying heavily on surveillance, flipping witnesses, entrapment. Yeah. It's not as fake as Russiagate or the Russian bounty story. It's not just something that was cooked up out of thin air.
Yeah, sure.
It involves enormous amounts of manipulation to gain the testimony that they need, and
including possibly violating attorney-client privilege, which was at least that's the complaint from Trump supporters, that they leaned on Trump's attorneys to get information from them, which violated attorney-client privilege. I mean, I don't know if that's true or not, but that's what the Trump camp is saying.
Well, what's being said in kind of CNN, MSNBC, corporate establishment media is that these are high crimes, that taking these documents into the bathroom as opposed to Biden taking them in the garage is atrocious, that neo-Nazis like Nick Fuentes could have gained access to nuclear codes of other countries and then then the Groypers would have exposed Israel's secret nuclear program. I don't know.
Yeah.
That might be like one of the only good things to come out of this, but the Rachel Maddow keeps kind of giving away the game. Last week we covered her pronouncing openly that Trump should be offered a plea bargain, that he agree not to run for president in exchange for him not going to jail. So is that? I heard you mention that she said it again.
She said it again. She said it again. And by the way, I mean, another, like David Petraeus, like he was caught taking classified information, giving it to his mistress to write a favorable book about him, because she was writing a biography about him.
Well, and to be his mistress.
And so it's like, so
and the book, by the way, was called All In.
That's really funny. So that's a case where Petraeus, like he's not just taking the information and like, having it in his bathroom and talking about it with his friends as Trump was doing. He's taking it to put it out there to put it out there publicly with a particular goal in mind. That's a lot more egregious than what Trump is accused of, which is basically, he's not accused of like leaking it or giving it to a hostile foreign power. He's just accused of improperly retaining it. So, but Petraeus got off with a slap on the wrist, and now he's welcomed on MSNBC, CNN as a voice of authority. But here's Maddow again, blurting out what she wants out of this, which is basically for this to be used to prevent Trump from running again.
So who knows what's going to happen? But if this is as strong a case as the indictment makes it look, right, and that's the prosecution's best case, it'll get challenged in court. It'll be an adversarial process. We'll see how strong the defense is. But if the indictment is that strong, and the Justice Department is going to treat this as a like case compared to other people who have been charged under the Espionage Act for mishandling classified information, then he is looking at jail time. And what would Donald Trump do to avoid jail time? I guess, I literally suppose that he would do anything. And if it's going to come to him avoiding jail time, now that this indictment exists, he's either going to have to win in court. Defending yourself against these charges by saying, yes, I did it, is not a great defense. And so how else can you avoid jail time? Well, you can plead in exchange for lenience. And we've seen lots of people, including Reality Winner, a very high profile case, plead in exchange for lenience and still get jail time. What can he offer prosecutors other than his confession, his cooperation? I mean, this is a crime he could only commit because he was in high public office. Spiro Agnew used that as a get out of jail free card. It was not just that he was vice president. It was that prosecutors assumed he was about to become president because Nixon was teetering. They were right. And in order to keep Agnew out, they traded him essentially jail time for his resignation. I'm not saying that's what the DOJ should agree to. I'm not saying that's what Trump should try for, or that his defense should offer it. I'm not even saying it would be good or bad for the country. I'm just saying the one other time we've dealt with this as a country, that's how we did it.
That's so funny. I'm not.
Well, we lost Aaron. Aaron has left the studio, but Rachel Maddow has, I don't know where she's hearing this from. Where is she hearing that there is a possibility that prosecutors will offer Trump that plea bargain? Aaron, you were saying.
Yeah, just like, it's so disingenuous. She's like, I'm not saying that's what should happen. I just can't stop talking about it. And I've been talking about this kind of scenario for years. I mean, before all this, when Trump was in office, she was saying that he should do the same thing over the Stormy Daniels charges, that to avoid being charged on the Stormy Daniels case. This is back in 2019. She was saying this. He should offer to trade away his resignation. He should resign as president when he's in the Oval Office in exchange for not being charged over Stormy Daniels. And this is the goal. I mean, this is the goal. This has been their quest for years because they hate his presidency. And it's like, to me, yes. I mean, it's true. He like rhetorically, he does articulate criticism of the war state. And as you mentioned, he, called out the Bush family and the Clinton family for all their neocon foreign policies. But it's also, they hate that he puts an ugly face on the empire. You need someone elegant like Obama who can talk about, spreading democracy and healing the nation. You don't like to have someone like Trump who blurts out sometimes that we're there in Venezuela to steal its oil, or we're there in Syria to steal the oil. So he's he's a brute, and they can't have that at the top of the empire. So they need to do everything they can to get him out. And somebody pointed out, I think it's a good point, that the irony of Trump being indicted under the Espionage Act after his Justice Department indicted Assange under the Espionage Act. And that's an example of how Trump, like, he was on the campaign trail, he was talking about, I love WikiLeaks. I love WikiLeaks. WikiLeaks is great. And it shows how, even as the president, how relatively powerless he was. And I'm not saying this was not his own choice, but ultimately, when William Barr and Pompeo wanted to go after Assange, he didn't stand in their way. And now the same law that was used against Assange is being used against him.
Yeah, Donald Trump has responded to this with more anti-war rhetoric that is designed to incite those he sees as his persecutors. It's pretty fascinating to see him continue to double down. He said, most recently, the warmongers, globalists, and deep staters are absolutely livid that I refuse to bend the knee to their endless war in Ukraine. I want peace. They want money and they want conflict, even if it means walking us into the brink of World War III, which frankly it is doing, and it is doing rapidly. I want people to stop dying. I want to end that war. I'll end that war between the two countries in 24 hours. I don't know how that's going to happen. It won't even take that long. I will get the war ended. I will stop all of those lives from being wasted and lost. And there'll be no more bombing of Ukraine. There'll be no more bombing of Russia. And everybody will be happy. So, I mean, he's promising peace in less than 24 hours, and even less than 24 hours. He's making that part of his campaign platform. Meanwhile, I mean, we've got Chris Christie, Mr. 1%. You have all these 1% candidates who are getting tons of airtime. And Chris Christie, I mean, I can't find the footage right now, but during his town hall, he actually said China wants to take over the United States, and that's why we need to give Ukraine all it needs. But he's actually also going after Trump as a Russian puppet.
And I don't know what President Trump is thinking about this, except that he's been a puppet of Putin from the time he was president. And it always was disturbing to me. We would argue regularly about Vladimir Putin during the time that he was president. And I think it's very clear what we need to do. We need to give the Ukrainians every piece of military hardware they need to protect themselves against this aggression.
Tapper's like, I'll just cuddle you. You're the perfect,
put it in my veins.
Perfect candidate. I just wish we could have more people, like decent Republicans like you. The Tapper and CNN, they love moderate Republicans more than any Democrat.
Oh, for
That's
sure.
what they want.
Oh, yeah.
And what Christie, for fiscal responsibility, or we need to stop all this needless pork barrel spending and then give all our money to Ukraine. And like, that's just right in Tapper's wheelhouse. And he's
Christie,
yeah.
Oh, like I was going to say, Christie, back when he was in Trump's inner circle, was defending him against all the collusion fiction stuff.
Oh,
yeah. But now, of course, now he wants to get back into, the establishment's good graces. So, of course, now he's swinging the other way. Just no principles or any concern for facts whatsoever. And again, I mean, we've pointed this out a million times. The idea that Trump was a puppet of Russia is just, you're talking about, like, policy-wise, his administration. I mean, put aside whatever he said personally. His administration, one of the most hawkish administrations on Russia that I can think of. I mean, killing the INF treaty, sending weapons to Ukraine that Obama wouldn't send, ramping up military exercises on Russia's borders, bullying NATO states into spending more on their military. I mean, that was the actual policy that Trump oversaw, whether he wanted to or not. And he didn't actually, but that's what he was pushed into because of Russiagate. He was boxed in and didn't stand up to it. And that's
whatever it is,
puppet in action.
It's all about what he says and not necessarily what he does, and that he's willing to meet with Putin or Kim Jong-un, or he spoke respectfully of Xi Jinping, especially early on in his presidency, and would call him a great friend. The Biden administration will never speak respectfully of the Chinese leader. They will never meet with a North Korean leader. It's the idea that Trump is transactional. Well, I don't know if that's necessarily the worst thing in the world to be transactional. So much of diplomacy is about just a mutually beneficial deal. And Trump prides himself on the art of the deal. Ultimately, he's not running a company. You don't put a CEO in the office in the US and expect some company leader to come in and cut deals with some board of directors that's comprised of yes men. You've got an administration infested with Fiona Hills and John Boltons, and you're just you're hamstrung. But just the point I wanted to make. You look at that kind of rhetoric, the Trump's response to the indictment, or Trump's response to Tucker's monologue. Come on. I mean, it's so obvious that this is selective, and it has so much to do with the role that he played and seeks to play on the international stage. It threatens everything that is dear to the people that control this country in a real material way. Even if he's not even going to be able to accomplish it. They don't want to have to spend another 4 years coming up with all of these crazy conspiracies and freaking out over Trump. It's very psychologically torturous for them, as much as they gain libidinal satisfaction from those fake scandals. They don't want to do that. They want someone like Chris Christie in there who can quell the Republican and the grassroots right-wing insurgency, and at the same time keep the system of proxy wars and threatening our enemies and pumping more money at looting the treasury and cutting taxes for the rich, just keeping that whole system going. And they can't find him.
Here's another Trump ally, much like Chris Christie, throwing him under the bus. This is Mike Pompeo, who is one of Trump's top officials, his Secretary of State, his head of the CIA. And here's Pompeo throwing Trump under the bus.
And is it right to charge him?
Brian, good morning. Great to be with you. Two things I think are both true at this point. First, if the allegations are true, there's lots of indications that they are. President Trump had classified documents where he shouldn't have had them. And then when given the opportunity to return them, he chose not to do that for whatever reason. You talked about me having classified documents. I handled thousands and thousands of them over my time in Congress and then as a CIA director and Secretary of State. I suppose we can all make mistakes and get them to the wrong place, but when somebody identifies that, you got to turn them in. And so that's inconsistent with protecting America's soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines. And if the allegations are true, some of these were pretty serious, important documents. And so that's wrong.
On what Donald Trump is facing, and is it?
So it's a lot like, and Aaron keeps hitting the cancel button on himself. It is a lot like Chris Christie's relationship with Trump, although Christie, he wanted to be the Department of Justice director. He wanted to be heading the DOJ. He wanted to be America's top cop. Pompeo, he rose to CIA director. And that was a point that Tucker hit in his monologue, was that Pompeo was the ultimate confidence man within the Trump administration. He would make Trump feel like he was beloved. He won Trump over. And at the same time, he was stabbing Trump in the back. And, I would even go back to a piece Gareth Porter contributed to us about a year and a half or 2 years ago on how Pompeo was the leading force pushing Trump to assassinate Qasem Soleimani and even drive the U.S. to the brink of war with Iran when Trump had initially rejected it. So now they've turned on Trump in an open way. Mike Pompeo is portraying himself as an honest, dignified servant of the public. And somehow it never ends well for these guys.
Just an example of how Trump went along with all these people's policies and people like Mike Pompeo, and they still stab him in the back anyway. But they also don't Mike Pompeo doesn't like the fact that Trump says stuff like this out loud. You're not supposed to say this when you're the president.
How about we're buying oil from Venezuela? When I left, Venezuela was ready to collapse. We would have taken it over. We would have gotten all that oil. It would have been right next door.
So you're just not supposed to say that. You're not supposed to say that we would have taken Venezuela's oil, even though that's part of the goal, is just to destroy the state, steal its resources, and hand them back to their rightful owners, which is, U.S.-backed oligarchs and the traditional rulers of Venezuela, not a country that tries to represent the poor majority. And they don't like that he says stuff like that. You're not supposed to blurt that out loud. You're supposed to pretend that we're supporting democracy in Venezuela.
Yeah, he said that about Syria, where the U.S. is there to steal the oil. He said that about Iraq, that we failed to get the oil and gas prices didn't go down. He also said, we have a lot of killers in this country. Why do you think we need to go kill Saddam Hussein?
Oh, they hated that one.
That was
hated
probably one of my favorite Trump comments. Close second would be Adam shit. But that was my definite favorite Trump comment. And, there's a question, why are so many on the left defending Donald Trump about keeping documents from the public? We're not defending the right of presidents to keep documents from the public. It's just, there's some members of the left who still, or people who are identified with the left, that still maintain some critical faculty and can see how phony the application of justice is here, when so many other presidents and public figures, as we pointed out, have concealed documents and prosecuted and persecuted private citizens for publicizing classified documents. So it's also about correctly forecasting where our political system is going. And I think we're going to be proven correct that millions and millions of Americans will feel disenfranchised. And whether Trump fails legally here, he will be bolstered politically. One other point I want to make is about inverted totalitarianism. It is a way that we can understand this country. Chris Hedges has pushed, has spoken about this a lot, or popularized the theories of Sheldon Wolin, who was a UC Berkeley, he was a political scientist, and he wrote Democracy Incorporated, Politics and Vision. Cornell West is a student of Sheldon Wolin. And I think it's appropriate for what we're going to experience in this election. But we're also we're increasingly seeing that the inversion is being removed. Inverted totalitarianism, and this is a description of it, I found in a obituary of Wolin, is different from classical forms of totalitarianism, does not find its expression in a demagogue or charismatic leader, but in the faceless anonymity of the corporate state. Our inverted totalitarianism pays outward fealty to the facade of electoral politics, the Constitution, civil liberties, freedom of the press, the independence of the judiciary, and the iconography, traditions, and language of American patriotism. But it has effectively seized all the mechanisms of power to render the citizen impotent. And I would also say to render independent media or critical journalism impotent. Unlike the Nazis who made life, this is Sheldon Wolin, unlike the Nazis who made life uncertain for the wealthy and privileged while providing social programs for the working class and poor, inverted totalitarianism exploits the poor, reducing or weakening health programs, regimenting mass education for an insecure workforce threatened by the importation of low-wage workers. So you get the point. But increasingly, I think we're seeing the facade, the democratic facade of elections and a free and independent media removed. And if you look at any poll, Americans are increasingly catching up to the British in realizing that their media is not free, that our elections are not necessarily clean, and that the judiciary is not independent. Obviously, people are Republican and Democrat have different reasons, but the Trump indictment is fueling that process. We are at the gray zone experiencing on a much different level how inverted totalitarianism works when Kit Clarenberg, one of our most valued contributors, is detained and interrogated about his work with us and about me and about the gray zone itself by British counter-terror police and remains under official investigation for the crime of journalism. Britain is a model for inverted totalitarianism. But soon, I mean, and the concept of totalitarianism is flawed itself, but it's a word that everyone understands. And I soon think we'll just be speaking about it without the inversions. So, Aaron, I know you have a hard stop around now. Or did you already leave? Oh, I'm here alone. All right. Well, Aaron's taken a week-long bathroom break. Or I think he's actually just completely left until next Friday. So we'll look forward to seeing him again. And we thank him for his contributions today. I want to continue on the theme of inverted totalitarianism. You know, it's very rare when we see journalists like Kit Clarenberg face the hard hand of the law, be actually forcibly taken into a room and interrogated and threatened, or Julian Assange in this system. They prefer to deal with independent media that threatens them with velvet glove censorship, labeling it disinformation, or just simply firing journalists who work within more mainstream or influential institutions because they threaten the establishment objectives that those institutions are intended to advance. You know, I can give many, many examples of that taking place. I mean, even someone as non-threatening as Mark Lamont Hill, when he was at CNN, was fired for making some mild statement in support of Palestinian human rights on Twitter. There's very little deviation is allowed. And one example that I want to point to that illustrates this trend took place in New Zealand, which is sort of which is a frontline country for advancing this counter disinformation agenda under the watch of Jacinda Ardern, who's now on her way out, and was a World Economic Forum pet project, seen as a avatar of the zero COVID model that locked down the entire country because there was one positive PCR test. She told people to watch what they say in public and not speak to their neighbors, to stay in their bubbles. And she's left the country in a state of liberal authoritarianism or neoliberal authoritarianism, where a single editor at Radio New Zealand, which is a state-sponsored media organization, has caused a national scandal. There is a national scandal at Radio New Zealand. It's been on the front pages of New Zealand's papers for weeks now. What happened there? Radio New Zealand has initiated an editorial audit over supposed pro-Russian editing of 22 stories which contain language that does not comport, this is my view, with US State Department approved talking points. It'll become clear that my view is correct as we look at some of these edits. So basically there was one editor in there who was using language that you're not allowed to use anymore over hotly contested issues like Ukraine or Israel. Here's one edit that caused a national scandal. This story was edited to describe the Maidan revolution as a coup. The copy has been changed to remove this description. So what was the Maidan revolution if not a coup? A elected president was violently removed by mobs who were fighting riot police in Maidan Square throughout late 2013 and early 2014. The supposed Euromaidan revolution of dignity was not even popular among a majority of Ukrainians. A Washington Post poll at the time, February 2014, found only a plurality of Ukrainians supported it. It's the kind of Galician Western Ukrainians who live around Lviv and parts of Kiev. But, then you had an entire population that did not support it, who were massacred for not supporting it, and a civil war broke out. So you're not allowed to say that at Radio New Zealand. What's next? An article is under review because it failed to justify the Ukrainian government's raid of Orthodox churches. Previous version of this article left out the context from a church with alleged Moscow ties from the top of the story. This line has been added back. Why would you need to say that unless you were justifying the raid. I mean, you can add context about what the Ukrainian government itself says, but this is where Radio New Zealand is demanding that the editor justify the raid with their own language. All right. Reverted back to Reuters copy. We're so sorry about that. This article contains a reference to undisputed truth. And so they couldn't even spell Maidan right in their editorial correction. A previous article, the version of this article, referred to military action being provoked by NATO expanding to its borders and a U.S. instigated coup in Ukraine during the 2014 Maidan protests. Spelled it wrong. This reference was removed. So you're not allowed to note that military action, in other words, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, had anything to do with the NATOization of Ukraine, placing hundreds of millions of dollars of weapons and troops trained by NATO and the US on Russia's immediate borders. Can't do that. This is great. A previous article, a version of this article, referred to neo-Nazism. You're not allowed to use the term neo-Nazism in the context of Ukraine. Those swastikas you see, those are, sometimes you see them displayed at marches honoring Stepan Bandera. Those are just Hindu symbols of wisdom. So we take this extremely seriously. We removed that at Radio New Zealand. Here's another good one. A previous version of this article included a section at the end to include this line. This implies that Russian forces must leave not just the territory occupied in recent weeks since their invasion in February, but also Crimea, which it annexed 8 years ago after a referendum, and parts of the eastern Donbass region. This has now been removed. So you're not, basically, what is the problem with this language? The problem is that you're not allowed to say that a referendum took place in Crimea. And you're not allowed to just refer to all of this as occupied territory. You have to refer to it all as occupied territory. Too much context. The referendum in Crimea showed that over 80% of residents of Crimea wanted to be removed from the control of the nationalist government in Kiev. An NBC News reporter went to Crimea 3 months ago or so and found that the population is completely mobilized in support of the Russian Federation's war. They don't want to be part of a government that is hostile to them and the Russian language. So what was removed from this article? I mean, this could go on. The removals and edits could go on all day. I might have to stop soon, but Tokyo worries that Russia's invasion of Ukraine has set a precedent that will encourage China to attack self-ruled Taiwan. And then it was changed to language, self-ruled Taiwan, who the U.S. is stocking up on weapons. That language was added. Context was added to help readers understand why China and Taiwan are experiencing such tensions. The stocking up on weapons has been removed. Taiwan's not stocking up on weapons. It's just there. China just hates it because it's there and it's free. I mean, that is how a lot of the experts in Washington understand it. It's just autocracy versus democracy. But this is autocracy through inverted form, removing this language and stirring up a national scandal because there's some editor who's adding inappropriate context. I mean, it's the same thing here, removing language that says that China says the U.S. is fanning flames by sending weapons to Ukraine. You can't cite the Chinese perspective to help readers understand. I mean, there's stuff about Israel in there. This article was inappropriate, or the language is inappropriate because it did not refer to several of the Palestinians killed by Israel as gunmen. So you have to add context to justify Israeli violence, but anything that provides context about U.S. conflict with China or Russia must be removed. So that really helps us understand the context. It helps us understand the political environment in New Zealand. And New Zealand really is kind of a test case for the rest of the West, as I've been saying. Something really, here's something that took place under Jacinda Ardern's watch that also highlights how media is being managed by the state under democratic guise. And it was reported by The Guardian in a completely propagandistic way. New Zealand to give $50 million to help ailing media groups during COVID-19 crisis. This was about creating a slush fund for Jacinda Ardern to fund media to advance her zero COVID agenda and to demonize and attack whatever alternative media existed as disinformation, Nazis, you know the deal. So something like $2.7 million of that $50 million slush fund went to an outlet called Stuff. Stuff is basically like a public-private partnership, but it poses as independent media. And Stuff led a campaign to literally ban a magazine in New Zealand called New Dawn, which is one of the few mass circulation alternative medias in New Zealand. Someone call it, a conspiracy site. It definitely went hard against the zero COVID regime that prevailed in New Zealand, that kept New Zealanders in some of the longest lockdowns on the planet. But there was one article in particular that they highlighted to attack this publication and get it banned. Let me just show, this is one of the few outlets that actually covered this, was 21st Century Wire. And the cover, you can see the cover of New Dawn here, has a masked, obedient urban dweller injected with multiple syringes. So the cover itself was highly provocative. It was, poking the Ardern government in the eye. That may be a reason why this was removed from stores. All retailers were pressured and distributors to remove this magazine. But there was also an article in it by TJ Coles, who has contributed to the Grayzone. He's written for us about he's contributed to us about US and British militarism in Africa. That was the subject of his last book. It's a well-reviewed book, and his pieces added a lot. And he published a piece about probably the most sensitive issue in New Zealand today, which is the Christchurch massacre by Brandon Tarrant. It is illegal in New Zealand to distribute footage of that massacre, which he filmed on a helmet cam, or to tell people where they can find that footage. And nowhere in TJ Cole's piece did he do that. What he did was he raised questions about Brandon Tarrant's links to the national security state. He's a former special forces officer. He had, I believe, somehow wound up in North Korea. He had traveled all around the world. And I don't know, I haven't studied this case enough to weigh in here, but it's just important to note what the content of the article was. And so New Dawn was accused of insinuating that the Christchurch massacre was a false flag. Nowhere in TJ Cole's piece did he say that it was a false flag. He noted many unusual circumstances that day in how the massacre was reported and about Brandon Tarrant's background. I am not going to draw any conclusions about the Christchurch massacre here. But we know that there is a long history of in the US, federal involvement with certain mass shooters. For example, Elton Simpson, who went to the Draw Muhammad contest in Garland, Texas, with his FBI handlers in tow, undercover handlers following him to make sure that he carried out a shooting at this center. He actually managed to shoot a cop in the leg before he was taken down. And he was told by an FBI informant, this is a person who was in jail, who was mentally disturbed, converted to Salafi Islam. he was told to tear up Texas hours before carrying out this shooting. So the FBI was egging him on. This is one of several examples. In, I believe it was 2013, there was a neo-Nazi named F. Glenn Frazier, veteran neo-Nazi, who went out in what he thought was going to be a blaze of glory in Kansas City. He was an old, decrepit man who was completely crazed, and he went and attempted to kill Jews at Jewish community centers and wound up killing 3 people outside who were not even Jewish. He had been maintaining on a chat site like American Vanguard or one of these neo-Nazi chat sites, chat logs. He'd written like 80,000 comments. One of those comments was about me. He called me a Jew journalist and linked to a video I did, like an interview I did about Sheldon Adelson's like influence on the Republican Party. So he wasn't even favorable to me. But some pro-Israel operatives on Twitter took that comment by him, screenshotted it, and then began blasting it all over social media, claiming that I was the mentor of a neo-Nazi mass shooter. And it got to the point where the Free Beacon, Neocon Rag in DC, and Haaretz, the premier liberal newspaper in Israel, actually reported that I was the mentor of a neo-Nazi mass shooter. So it just became this giant psyop to discredit me because I was, taking on Israeli apartheid. And Haaretz eventually retracted its article. It was totally fake. But I hadn't even thought much about this mass shooting. I then looked into this guy, Glenn Frazier, and I learned that he had been recruited by the FBI while he was in prison and had been maintaining a role as a federal informant throughout much of his life. So they knew a lot about him, but somehow weren't able to keep him under control. So the point is, I think it's legitimate to raise questions. And New Zealand has banned an entire magazine from circulation. And it's been banned through, of course, private entities under pressure from a public, from a outlet, Stuff, that is funded through Jacinda Ardern's slush fund. They banned it on the basis of simply raising questions about something that is extremely sensitive. And it's coming here. It's going to, this regime of censorship is coming here through various means. We talk about it all the time. One way that it will come here is through in the legal enforcement of nebulous abstract concepts like safety. So here is a comment by an Irish legislator from the Green Party who just says it openly. And we hear this language from AOC a lot about safety or literal violence, which is something that is often not literal. I remember when literal violence used to be like the beatdown of Rodney King or bombing a country. But I haven't heard it spoken so nakedly before.
When you think about it, all law, all legislation is about the restriction of freedom. That's exactly what we're doing here, is we are restricting freedom, but we're doing it for the common good. You will see throughout our Constitution, yes, you have rights, but they are restricted for the common good. Everything needs to be balanced. And if your views on other people's identities go to make their lives unsafe, insecure, and cause them such deep discomfort that they cannot live in peace, then I believe that it is our job as legislators to restrict those freedoms for the common good.
So she's not talking about literal violence. She's talking about certain groups being made to feel uncomfortable. Those who do that through their language must be restricted. In other words, they must be criminalized. This is a debate over a hate speech and incitement bill. Now, a lot of people on the left support this. I mean, this is a leftist legislator from the Green Party. But let's consider something that happened closer to home with a student at the City University for New York Law School commencement, Fatima Mohammed, who's of Yemeni descent. She delivered a speech in which it was an incendiary speech condemning Israeli apartheid. And she has been condemned in response by everyone from the New York City mayor, Eric Adams, to Senator Ted Cruz in Texas, to this guy Richie Torres, who's a congressman in the Bronx, like next door to AOC, who's just completely owned by the Israel lobby, like just one of the top recipients of AIPAC. He's just there to be a black face sprouting or Puerto Rican face sprouting pro-Israel rhetoric. And they've all called for the school to punish her, they're essentially wanting to criminalize her for her speech. And I was watching a ultra Zionist professor at CUNY condemn her in an interview with the New York Post. The New York Post has been all over this. And he said that what he said is Zionists are a protected group and you are in violation of the law if you are making a protected group feel unsafe. So this is a right-wing pro-Israel figure saying the same thing this left-wing Irish legislator said. And he's conflating Judaism with Zionism, which is what anti-Semites do. Zionists are not an ethnic group. That is an ideological position that many Christians actually uphold, many Gentiles uphold, because they see Israel as the future landing pad for the Messiah. So we're in a very dangerous place when we start legislating what hate, rhetorical hate and incitement is, but we're going there. Who determines what disinformation is? When Rachel Maddow refuses to show a Donald Trump press conference responding to the indictment because he will speak lies, she's determining what the truth is, when she has spouted some of the most consequential forms of disinformation and lies in the last 6 years. So it's not something, this is not a regime, this inverted totalitarian regime of censorship that will target exclusively the right, although it is disproportionately targeting the right now. We can see it's impacting the left. In fact, let me show you this if I can pull it up. Here's something that took place clearly under state pressure, and we don't know which state it is. We've seen the FBI go to Twitter on behalf of the Ukrainian intelligence services and ask them to remove Aaron Mate's account. But here we have City University of New York's Jewish Law Student Association, who supported Fatima Mohammed's right to free speech, having their statement of support removed by Google Docs under violation of terms of service. Just a Google Doc was removed because it supported a student who said naughty things about Israel. And it's a classic case of inverted totalitarianism where a corporation is claiming that its terms of services have been violated, but there is obvious state pressure here. But the state doesn't have to take responsibility. There are no state fingerprints. So we're not looking at this as state censorship when it in fact is. So I don't know if we got any more questions or comments to address. Yeah, there's nothing else. I think I'll leave it there. And we'll pick up where we left off next week. Thanks everyone for being here. We had a lot of viewers this time. If you're in the DC area, I'm going to be at Magooby's with Jimmy Dore telling some jokes July 14th and 15th. Yeah, so get your tickets at Magooby's. And we're on Pacifica Radio, KPFK LA 90.7 every Tuesday, I think at 5 p.m. and a Sunday at WBAI New York at 6 p.m. So you'll get highlights of this show and other interviews we've done there. And you can also see much of what we've been doing on my podcast. You just search Max Blumenthal on Anchor FM or Spotify, wherever it is, if you missed anything. But thanks a lot for liking, subscribing, and we're going to have more big news next week. We have some heavy reports lined up. So watch this space. Peace.